Okay. So, my first question is about Beauty Intolerable itself. What attracted you to the poetry of Edna St. Vincent Millay in particular to write for?
I discovered her poetry actually, who came in one day with what lips my lips have, what lips have kissed, and and I thought, what an incredible poem! Wow, this is really something. And of course, I knew the name, and I maybe had, in grade high school, whatever, read her poetry, but I didn't had never read it as when I was a composer and had been thinking about what it makes for a poem to set. And then I went and started to read her poetry, and I realized that the poetry was rich in rhyme and alliteration and sound, and it made sense. You could understand it, and it communicated. And she was writing at a time when this kind of very E. E. Cummings abstract, poetry was also on the rise. And people put her down. In my youth, I remember, she wasn't sophisticated like, T.S. Eliot, and it wasn't, she was too obvious. You could understand the message. It was too understandable. And so I fell in love with her poetry, and I realized she was a feminist, and she was, coming at things from a very different perspective than a lot of women and in her day, because her day is like, 1910, 1920, 1905. I mean, this is a long time ago. And I mean, she lived to the 50s, but she died around 1950. She was around 55. But, she lived that first half of that 20th century. And it just so happened that as I got more and more interested in her poetry, her and St. Vincent Millay's estate is 5 minutes from my house or 10 minutes from my house. I had known about the Millay colony. I had sat on their board when they had to adjudicate. It's an artist place. They have this biggest house, and then they have a modern facility where people can go and do, be poets or be composers or be painters or whatever. And I had been up there many times, but now I became very interested in, and the guy that was running it, Peter was knew everything about her because he'd been the director for many years, and he opened up. He gave me private tours of her house, of her bedroom, of her studio, her study. Her library is left with the books open to the pages they were the day she was reading them. I saw the back stairway up to her bedroom where she fell when she died, and I saw her private pictures, and I just learned so much about. I mean, I'd read several biographies, and he filled in lots of the blanks and lots of the stuff that the estate didn't want out. And I thought at one point that I wanted to write an opera about her, and then I decided, well, her poetry is enough. And she was complicated, and I didn't want to engage that complication. I wanted her pure spirit as a poet. And so I said, it's enough for me just to set these poems. And I didn't know how many I was going to set. And the first one was Mindful of You, was the first one I set. And I set it in memory of Diane Kalish. She was Gil Kalish's wife. And I didn't know then that I was going to make all these songs. And then a good friend of mine, Elaine Bonazzi, did you know who she was? She was a very famous mezzo soprano. She was my colleague at Stony Brook, and she sang a lot of at Santa Fe. When Santa Fe first became this place where they did a lot of new opera, she sung all the roles. She sung Baba the Turk for Stravinsky when they did the Rake's Progress. She sang everything. She was an amazing woman, and she was retiring. And I wrote 3 songs in honor of her, and I wanted them to be happy, peppy, snide, snarky kind of songs. Nothing too somber, right? Because she was very peppy, a very peppy woman. And she died a couple of years ago. And then the rest came.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously doing a songbook, and there were 3 singers I worked with Lisa Renee Harmon, Deanne Meek, who you've seen the, and Lauren Flanagan. You've seen the, they sang the premieres. I wrote a different piece for her on loving, but what the Sod and Earth and Spring is, the Mindful of You is in both books. But for Deanne, I made it a little bit lower. I didn't change the key, but I just changed a couple notes so they wouldn't. I think a lot of these things could be for either or. I don't think that there's real categories of them. And I am also transposing some of them to make some of the two really high ones a little bit lower so other people can sing them.
And when you were choosing the poems, was it hard for you to choose them, or was it like you read them and you immediately knew like this is speaking to me and something was creating in your head?
It's real easy. And I had several books of hers that I would read, and one in particular was I just turn a page down every time I really like something, and I would basically, okay, I'm starting a new one today, and I'd open up the book and I'd see where it landed, and if I looked at it, I said, yeah, that's one of the ones I want to do, or no, I don't want to do that one, and I just moved around, and they found me, and I found them, and I didn't even know how many, but when I set "What Lips May Lips Have Kissed," I was done. I just said, okay, I'm done now. I just, because that was the one that had brought me there, and I was not going to set it until I was ready, and when I was ready, I was done. And there was enough, there's enough of them, and they cover lots of aesthetic worlds.
And when you are setting music to poetry, like what's your process? Because I find that the music in Beauty Intolerable is so perfectly describing the text. Like they go together so well. And how is your process like figuring out how you want to write a certain piece based off the text?
I think that they were warm-ups for my opera, and I think of each one as an aria. Each one is a sound world, it's an idea world. So I usually try to think, what is this about? Like the one about Penelope weaving. I said, okay, so Penelope's there at her loom, and she's weaving. So I tried to make an accompaniment that reminded me of a loom. Thug, thug. I 40 years ago, I wrote a piece based on Ezra Pound's canto, one of his cantos, and in it, Pound describes the loom of Circe as going thick thug, and I thought, that's and so I made this accompaniment that's the loom. She's going back and forth, and she's obsessing, and she's thinking, and she's still working at a loom. We've all done that. So each one of them seems to have a. I don't start with a vocal line. I start with a compositional motive or idea that is defined by the piano. And then, like Thursday, I wanted this kind of bluesy dun, 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 dun. I'm singing it faster than it should go. I that was an idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Stick everything in, once you do that. So each one has a vision, has an concept, and that's why they're different. Because for each poem, I chose one piano or compositional idea that permeates it.
And so for the two rounds that start and end this like songbook, what was your like idea? I watched a video somewhere, I don't know if it was the Zoom launch party that you were having for your album, but you said like you wrote it so that they could walk on and walk off. But what was your process of like how to create them to be completely different like songs with the same text?
So they're both the same poem, right? One of her really short ones. And didn't you see you must have seen it at Songfest last year.
Yes.
Basically I wrote one and I didn't know if I liked it. Then I wrote another one. And so I said, well, okay, I got two. One's going to start, one's going to end. And honestly, it was like that.
Yeah, because I love the two rounds because I feel like the energy of the music changes the meaning of the poem. And it's just like takes sort of the two sides of the coin that she was actually like explaining by explaining the two sides of the.
The first one is ceremonial. It's Greek. It's like women dancing around an altar. I did some Sappho songs when I was really young. The idea of these women enacting some kind of ritual it's ritual. And the second one is like, okay, we've done it all. It's jazzy and it's hot and it's sexy and it's playful, right? So that was how I thought of it too.
Yeah. Um, and actually, you brought up the Ezra Pound setting that you did, and I have a question about that. So you set his poem. When you look for poems to set, are you drawn to a specific type of person that sort of is like what attracted you to his work, I guess?
That was a very, very specific answer. I was in American Academy of Rome at the time. I had a Rome Prize, and I was working on something else. And the person in the, American Academy of Rome was this extraordinary villa in Rome, and I had this gorgeous studio in a beautiful garden and out in the back, behind the main house, and because pianos make noise, and they put the composers outside, and the person in the cabin or in the studio nearby was a poet and a pound expert, and he was always reading me this poetry. He always, would walk into the garden, and he would read this poetry to me. And he read me that particular poem, Canto 39, and I thought, oh my God, this is so outrageous. And it's sexy, and I don't understand a word of what's he saying, but somehow it's amazing. And a few weeks later, I got a telegram, because in those days they didn't have email. And if somebody wanted to reach you quickly, they sent you a telegram. And we're talking 1979. Okay, if you can, you were not born yet, but that happened then. And I got a telegram saying the Tanglewood was commissioning me to write a piece for the Fromm Commission about what I like to do. And I just said, I want to set that sexy, weird, crazy poem that John read me. And so what was cool about it was has all these references to all these Greek and early English and Dante and Catullus and Ovid and and Greek, all this Greek. There were people at the American Academy in Rome who could translate everything for me, and I found a book in the library which had all of the references to where all of the references in the cantos from Pound come. So I could look up every book, and I could find the original source, and I could read with the context in which these things came. And then I had people to discuss it with, and I really understood that poem inside and out. So we're constantly changing from this vision of Beatrice. In Dante, Beatrice is the holy, spiritual goddess woman, almost not sexual because she's virginal, right? And Circe stands for goddess, woman, sexual, sexy, powerful. She turns men into pigs. She turns men into swine because men act like swine. I mean, she's still very pure, but it's a kind of sensual, sexual thing. And then Odysseus comes, and she says, okay, you can stay here, and I'll even make you a god if you want to come and stay with me. And he stays with her for a couple of years. So it's the total sensual erotic to the total purely spiritual, virginal. And he just keeps going back and forth like this from one to the other. And I thought that was fascinating for me to set. Just really was.
So a lot of Edna St. Vincent Millay's poetry, is about womanhood, I guess, and also like how it doesn't fit the confined idea of what a woman was at the time, and she really like was a different character than you would normally see. Do you think that in your career you have been, or how you have felt limited because you're labeled as like a woman composer instead of just like a composer?
Yeah, I lived with it all my life.
Hmm. Yeah.
I think it's different now for the youngsters, young people coming up. But in my day, it was always an issue, a problem. I mean, I was the second woman to get a Rome Prize. That was a big deal back then. Getting a Rome Prize is always a big deal, but it just wasn't the domain of women. I know that I was passed over many times because I was a woman. I know instances where people said, "Oh, they want you to do this thing," and then somebody else would be given the opportunity. A man would be given it. But I had women composer mentors like Miriam Gideon. You should check her music out. Beautiful composer. And Miriam would have had a much bigger career had she been a man. So, and now the young my students are having, huge careers, at age 30. So, it just depends, life. Oh, here's a message from Don Upshaw. Anyway, it just, it's it's my life, it's been my journey, it's the next generation's journey will be different. You're I'm old enough to be your grandmother, so your generation is too beyond behind me, so uh it is what it is, and my opera Thousand Splendid Suns is somehow it brings everything about women. It's way more dark and violent than Edna. And I usually veer towards the happy, and my other operas were always comedies. And when I was in my early 30s, I wrote an opera about a woman who was very smart and couldn't find a man who was smart enough for her. And it was very much all my friends, we were all not married and we were all trying to be career women. But it was set in ancient India, so it had this total playfulness. And it was based on an ancient, about an Indian story about the princess who's very smart and can't find a man who's smart enough for her. Kind of a twist on Turandot, but in Turandot, she's bitter and she's angry and she is going to kill the men that don't indicate it. She's got a rape thing going on in the background, that is what didn't interest me. This was just pure. She's sophisticated, she's smart, and the guys just aren't good enough for her. But it was much easier.
You aren't like confined to one type of composition, like you do atonal stuff, tonal. What always drives you to like create new things instead of like maybe sticking to one like niche or genre?
You can never, if you write a really good piece, you can never write the same piece again. I learned that early on. Like I wrote a piano trio when I was, in the 91. So what was that? 30 years ago. And it was my best piece to date at that point. Got a lot of play. And then I kept trying to rewrite that piece. You can't rewrite, it comes out, it's fresh. Only things that are fresh, that you're trying new things, that you're in a new space. That's, either it works or doesn't work. That's one, it works or doesn't work. Not everything works. Some things are better than others. You never know how it's going to be, what it's going to be. And I have always been using different kinds of sources of things to interest me. At the time I was, a lot of Jewish music had influenced my early 90s music. The end of pieces, I was like thinking about, I was listening to a lot of jazz. You can hear that influence in that, right? Then I started studying Hindustani music in preparation for the opera because it took place in Afghanistan, and I needed to focus on some aspect of that musical culture. And Hindustani music, which is the classical music of North India and Afghanistan and Pakistan and all of that area, because they're all mixed together. We Westerners, the British separated them all out, but they're culturally much closer than the lines that separate Pakistan from Afghanistan from India would be had the Westerners not gone in there. So I studied Hindustani music because I decided that I wanted to hear the classical music, because I'm a classical musician, and it's very, I studied with an amazing teacher, and it influenced everything about my music. It influenced not just the opera, but it's in everything that I've written ever since, and it's now part of me. It's what do you call it? It's internalized. Just like I can write a Jewish melody now, that an original Jewish melody, it's totally internalized. And I mean, jazz, I'm not a jazz musician, so that was a little more surface, I think, but I think some of the but remember, I was raised with Bob Dylan and Peter, Paul and Mary, and all that folk song stuff. That's very much a part of my voice. That high school space, I was also raised on Bartok, so Bob Dylan and Bartok. When I went to graduate school, of course, they made me write all that atonal music, right? So that was the only thing that was allowed. And so not that I don't love Schoenberg and Weber, and I do, and I love Stravinsky also, and Debussy, and that music is very much a part of me, and it's all hearable in my music.
Yeah.
Tonality and atonality as also an emotional spectrum. If you want to really dig into somebody's inner psyche and go dark, there's nothing like atonality for doing that. We know that in the movies all the time, right? And there's nothing like a melody to open the heart out. So they're both. I do both. they all fit with me.